Hey everyone, Wes here. First of all, I want to send a shout out to you guys for all the support and comments I've received. It's been fun so far working on these videos. And I know these last few videos have been kind of a long .NET project, but I do have more JavaScript and Angular and React and some other videos in the pipeline that I think will be really fun too. So this video, part 3 of this .NET Core MVC application, is going to be focused on implementing the business logic of our application. So it's going to be kind of broken down into 3 parts. First, we're going to build out the business logic in our checkout service, and then we're going to go through and complete our views for checkouts and library assets. And then finally, towards the end of the video, we're going to do some bug fixes for some issues that we introduced in the first part of the video. So hope you guys enjoy it, and yeah, thanks for watching. Okay, so at the end of our previous video, we had just left off having completed this catalog index page, which contains a list of all of the assets in our system here, and so we have a row in a table for each of those assets. We'll worry about things like pagination a little bit later, but at this point I'd like to go ahead and create a detail page for our assets. And we'll create it such that when we visit this detail action on our catalog controller, we'll visit the corresponding detail page for that particular asset. So we'll go back into our catalog controller, and you can see that we have an index action here. So I'm going to actually minimize this, and we're going to create a new action. So it'll be public iActionResult detail. So we'll save our asset, and then we're going to use that iLibraryAsset interface, for which we have written a service to implement. And we're going to use the getById method that we've implemented, and we're going to pass it an ID. So when we visit the detail action on this controller, we're going to want to pass an ID value to it in the route. And so we'll do that by simply passing this int ID to our detail method here. And so our service is going to go out and return this asset from our database. In fact, if we go into our service layer and take a look at that again, just to review, it's a very simple method that you can see here. We're going to get all of the assets from our database, and we're actually going to include some of their navigation properties, and then we'll grab the first or default collection from that set, where the ID that we pass this method corresponds to the asset ID. And again, the asset ID, if we take a look at our library asset model, is just an integer and will actually be the primary key on this library asset table in our database. So we'll go back. So we're returning an instance of a library asset with this getById method, and I'm just going to store it in this asset variable. And then in a similar fashion to the way that we did for the index, where we selected the result that we get back from the database into a view model, we're going to do the same thing here. So what I'm going to do is, in our models directory, again the models directory that is in our web layer, so that should be in the library project here, under the catalog subdirectory, I'm going to right click and add a new class, and we're going to just call this asset detail model. Okay, now this view model is actually going to have quite a bit on it. It's going to have the asset ID, of course, on it. We'll have the title of the work. We'll again have the author or director. We'll have the type. So again, this in our case will be either book or video. We'll have the year. And the reason I'm using an integer for a year here is because this way it will actually be really easy to represent years that are in BC, for instance. And then we'll have the ISBN. We'll have the Dewey call number. We'll have a status. And so this will be what we display on the page when we are showing whether or not the book is checked out or lost or available. Then we'll use a decimal type to store the cost of the asset, store the asset's current location. We'll have a string that stores an image URL. Let's create a string for the patron name, maybe who has this asset checked out. Then in fact, let's store a checkout object. If you control period here on checkout, we can make sure that we import the library.models namespace. Okay, and then let's put 2 more properties on our class here. We'll have a collection, so an IEnumerable of checkout history, and we'll call this just checkout history. And this will of course represent a set of all of the checkouts that all of our patrons have placed on this particular asset that we can display on the detail page. And then I'm also going to create a collection of what I'll call an asset hold models, which we'll call current holds. And I'm just going to define that class here in the same file. So we have a new class, asset hold model, which will just have two properties on it, a patron name, which will store as a string, and the time that the hold is placed, which for simplicity's sake, we're just going to store as a string too. You could also store this as a date time if you wish. Okay, so as you can see, we actually have quite a lot here. We have a bunch of different things that we are going to display on this asset detail page. So let's head back into our controller. Okay, so far we have pulled an asset back from our database, and this will be represented in the form of our domain model. But what we need to do is to essentially pass it to the view in the form of the view model that we just created. So let's go ahead and do that. If we just create a new asset detail model, and then we just need to assign all of the properties that are on this view model using our data. So for instance, we have this int ID, which is just what we pass the method. But then for the rest of the properties here, we will assign like this. So this domain model ID should correspond to the title that is also on our view model. So asset.title, year, cost. And then for something like status, if you recall, status is a navigation property that is on our asset domain model object, which itself contains properties. So we'll be looking for the status name here and the image URL. Okay, and then we have this author or director property, for which we're going to use our library asset service to get author or director, which is a method that we implemented on our iLibrary asset interface. And we just need to pass the asset ID there, the current location. Again, we'll use our service to return the current location. We just need to pass it the ID. And it looks like our service is actually returning an instance of a library branch object. And the property that is on our view model is a string. And so I should just be able to call .name here. And so now we're just going to return the name. If you hit F12, that will take you to where this property is defined, and you can see it's defined inside of our library branch class, which is in our data layer. And so the name here is a string. And so this get current location returns an instance of the actual library branch object which has name on it. So then let's get the Dewey call number and the ISBN, again implemented by our service. Okay, and there are a few more properties on our asset detail model, which we will now need to write an additional service for. And this will correspond to the holds and the checkout system that we need to create. And so what I'd like to do now is actually just go ahead and complete this model, and we'll set it up so that we return it to the view. So if we return view and we pass it the model that we are working on, this controller action is now complete. And so we will actually be able to visit the detail page once we create it. We'll go ahead and implement our checkout and hold logic so that we can complete our view model here. But first, let's be sure that all the data is getting passed to our view properly. So if we come down into our views directory here under catalog, I'm going to create a new view. So I'll add a new item. And if you select web and then go to MVC view page, and call this detail.cshtml. And we're going to keep this relatively simple for the time being. But in any case, I'm going to get it set up with a div of class container. We will use some existing bootstrap styles here since we have access to them. And we'll give it a class of page header, clearfix, detail heading. And I'll go ahead and create an H2 tag here. We'll say view library item, so this will be at the top of our page. Create another div of class jumbotron. And inside it we'll create a row, and we'll have a div that's going to store the image for our asset. And so now the source of that image is actually going to be the image URL that's on our model. And so what we need to remember to do here, what I need to remember to do, is to go to the top of this file and declare our model directive here. So at model asset detail model. And so now Razor should have access to all of the properties that are on asset detail model. such as our image URL. So I'm going to go ahead and tuck our div inside of the column and the column inside of the row. I'm not going to talk too much about the meaning of the different Bootstrap classes that we have here. We'll get into, again, more detail about that towards the end of the project. Now inside of the second column, here's where I'd like to place more data about our library asset. So I'm just going to create a paragraph tag for each of these different properties that we'll show information about. And I'm going to give each of them an ID as well. So we got our title, we got our author or director, status, our type. And then now what I'd like to do is to create a little section here that's going to look different depending on the current status of the asset. So we want the user to be able to check the item out if it is available. So if no one else has it checked out or has a hold on it, then the patron who visits this page should be able to check out the library asset. And if it is checked out, then I'd like to display the name of the patron who has this item checked out. And so we'll start with an @, or if you hear me say spiral, that's what I mean here. So this allows us to write razor syntax to dynamically generate the HTML that we display. So I'll say if model.status is equal to checked out. Then I'm going to create a paragraph tag, say like item patron, and we'll say checked out by, and then @model.patron name. And so the patron who has this item checked out, this property will be available to us once we actually wire up our checkout service and that logic, and we implement that in our controller. And now let's say that if the model status is equal to available, we'll display a button to the user to allow them to actually check this item out. And so I'll see role is equal to button. And now we're going to use these HTML tag helpers provided to us by ASP .NET Core. So if you're not familiar with what's happening here, we are essentially just going to specify a controller, in our case catalog, and ASP-action, so an action on that controller. In this case, we'll create an action called checkout, which is going to allow us to check out this item. And then an ASP-route ID. And again, this is just going to be @model.assetID, of course. And so that's our link or our button here. And so inside of here, I can just say checkout. Okay, so if the item's out, we are going to display to the user that it's checked out. If it's available, we're going to display a button which they can click. When they click, it's going to activate our checkout action in our catalog controller. And then once we wire up the logic to check out that item, that's what will happen when this button is clicked. So when the item's checked out, let's also provide them with something similar to actually check the item back in. So I'm just going to copy this line. I'm actually going to paste it twice because we'll also create a button to place a hold on the item. And so we'll just change the styling a little bit using existing Bootstrap classes. We're going to use the same controller in both cases. And so we'll have a check-in action and a hold action. And in both cases, of course, we still need to pass the asset ID here as our ASP route ID. Say place hold for the link where we want to place the hold. And of course, check in for the link where we want to check the asset back in. Okay, so now we have some very simple logic here. It says if this asset is checked out, in which case it will have a status of checked out. Then we're going to show who it's checked out by, and we're going to give the user the option to either check it in or place a hold on it. And then if it is available, then we simply want to give the user the ability to check the item out. And then finally what I'm going to actually do is, since we have a status of lost, is I'm going to go ahead and create one more if statement here, and we're going to say if model.status is equal to lost, then I'm simply going to display a message that says this item has been lost. And then just in case the item is found, we'll create a button that we can actually mark a lost item as found. And so provide it with another Bootstrap styling here, so button danger, and then our action will be mark found. And again, we'll pass it the asset ID, and here we'll just say mark found, mark item found. Okay, cool. And then what I'll do is create one more div here. So I'm just going to actually copy this column here and come down, and we'll paste it here. We'll give it another class here of detail info. And instead of a div here, I'm actually just going to implement a table. and it won't have a head. We'll just have 3 rows here with the ISBN, which is on our model at model.isbn. And so I'll paste 2 more rows here, and we'll display the call number for the DOI call number, and we'll display the asset cost here. So we can say at model.cost, and we can call this like replacement cost. Okay, great. So we have a little bit more information to add to this page. So I'd like to show the checkout histories and the current holds that the item has on it. Okay, so that is our basic detail page so far. So if we come up to www.root, that is the directory which contains our static files. You may have like a site.css or some other file in your CSS folder here. If you don't, just be sure that you have a CSS directory and then place a styles.css file here. And what I'm going to do is, there's a lot here, and it's quite frankly not very well organized at this time, but I'm just going to scroll down and I'll show you what I have. I'll paste a link in the description below to the CSS file that you can copy and paste if you like. You can write your own, and then ultimately when this project is complete, I will have all of the files up on GitHub for you to download if you'd like. But for now, I'm also just going to scroll down, again, in case you'd like to go through the effort of copying any of this out by hand. Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's not very well organized. I just wrote the styling out for all the various selectors as I went along and kind of needed to tweak things. Definitely at the end of this project, when we think about the areas of the application that need refactoring, we should also come back and organize our CSS selectors here and label them so that this file will be much easier to maintain. This is what it is for right now, and it should serve our purposes just fine for developing at this stage. I'm gonna go ahead and close this. And then now if we come down into the layout.cshtml file, this is in the web layer under views and then in the shared directory, you can see what I've done here to implement some of the custom styles is I have replaced the templates head tag with my own head tag here. Main difference is that I've updated the title tag here, and then I've also brought in some external style sheets. So we have a style sheet coming from Google Fonts, and I've got one here coming from Material Design Lite. Then I've got one here from the Bootstrap CDN. And then you can see finally I'm bringing in the styles.css file, which is just relative to our www.root directory in our web layer. Everything else here on the layout page I will change in a little while. So we've got the navigation bar to work on at some point and maybe some other tweaks here. But for now, this is what we have. You'll recall our render body method, which was discussed in, I believe, the first video. This is where all of the views for our application will actually get injected, if you will. And so HTML that gets rendered in those views gets injected here and is wrapped by the rest of this layout.cshtml file. So let's go ahead and fire up the application again and see if the styles are working for us. Okay, so the home page still looks the same. As I said, we haven't done much to change that yet, but we will now visit our catalog index page. Okay, and you can see that that's looking a little bit better now. The images are sized more correctly, and if we click on an item now, we'll get taken to the detail page that we just worked on, and this is also looking a lot nicer than it would if we didn't have any custom styling. So what I'd like to do now is to work on the checkout logic, and as you might expect, we'll be working on that business logic inside of our service layer. So similar to how we had an iLibrary asset and a library asset service, we will now create a checkout service and an iCheckout interface. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the server. And now over here on the right, I'm going to collapse our views. I'm going to collapse the wroot. And what I'd like to do now is in our data layer, so in library data, I'm going to right click and we're going to add a new item, and we're going to add an interface, and we're going to call it iCheckout. And we're going to make it public first of all. Yeah, and so I think that this will be good enough for now. We've got quite a few methods that we need to implement here. And so now we'll go ahead and create our checkout service that will implement this interface. So in our service layer, I'm going to right click on library services and we'll add a new class. We'll call it checkout service. Okay, so first of all, let's go ahead and make this class public. And we need to actually implement our iCheckout interface here, of course. And if we control period here, you'll see that we have the option to implement the interface. And it's going to give us a sort of scaffolded out class of methods here that are implementing all of the methods that we have defined inside of our checkout interface. Also, you're going to want to make sure that you bring in the library data.models namespace. Okay, so we've got a lot of methods that we need to actually write out here to complete all the business logic here that's in this service. The first thing I like to do though, before we forget, is to head back into our startup.cs file, and inside of the startup class, if we head down here into the configure services method, if you recall, I mentioned that we'll be revisiting this particular method anytime that we need to leverage dependency injection to be able to inject these services into the different areas in our application, such as our controllers. So we'll need to do the same here for our checkout service. So we'll say iCheckout here, and instead of library asset service, of course, we're going to use the checkout service. Okay, so with that done, now we can close startup.cs for right now, and we can start working on the methods that are in our checkout service. Now I'm actually going to work through these rather quickly. We spent a little bit more time in the previous video looking at link for the first time in this project. We're going to be using a lot of link here to pull data back from our database, or in the first method's case, add data to our database. So I will write everything out and talk about it as I go, but nonetheless we'll move a little bit more quickly than last time, just for the sake of brevity, and because a lot of this logic is relatively straightforward. So let's go ahead and first of all make our constructor. So we will have a public checkout service, and we'll have a private field here in order to store that context. So I'm just going to define a private library context field. And so now we will have access to the context throughout the rest of this service class. So if we look at the add method, this one will be very straightforward. We'll call context.add, and we'll pass it the instance of the new checkout. And then of course we need to call context.saveChanges. And as I mentioned in the previous video, depending on your logic to add records to your database, you may or may not want to call save changes directly inside of the add method. For instance, if you are doing multiple adds or doing multiple operations, you are only going to want to call save changes once after you have completed all of those operations. Okay, our check-in item and check-out item, those are actually going to be methods which have quite a bit more complexity to them, and we're going to revisit those in just a minute. So I'm going to move these towards the bottom of our class for right now, and we'll head back up towards the top of this class. Our getAll method is going to be very straightforward. We are actually just going to call context.checkouts and simply return that. And so this will simply return all instances of checkouts from our database. So our getById method here, this one will also be relatively straightforward. Let's just return all of our checkouts first of all. And then what we're going to do here is call first or default on this result. And that's going to require us to bring in link. So if you control period here, we'll bring in the system.link namespace. And we're going to just throw our link query inside of this first or default method here. And so this method will return the first or default member from the collection getAll, where the object's ID parameter from that collection is equal to the ID that we pass this method. Okay, and now I'm going to head down to get checkout history. Again, another simple query here. In this case, we're going to return from our checkout histories where the library asset on the checkout history, that library asset's ID is equal to the ID that we pass this function. And in order to be able to ensure that our library assets collection, this navigation property on checkout histories, actually returns a collection of values, I'm going to call .include, and we need to control period here to make sure that we're using Entity Framework Core, and we're just going to include library asset, and I'm actually also going to include library card here. Okay, so when we return this collection of checkout histories, the collection of library assets and library cards returned with them will have values now. Otherwise, these related entities would not be included in our query results. So let's come down here to get current hold patron name. This one's going to be related to our hold logic, so I'm actually going to move some of these methods down to the bottom of our class for the time being as well. And again, continue looking at some of the more simple methods to fill out first here. I'm also just going to clean up this a little bit so that we can read it a little bit better. Okay, so get current holds. This one, again, just returning a simple collection that we have access to. And so we're going to return context.holds, and we'll go ahead and include here the library asset navigation property, and we'll say where the library asset ID is equal to the ID that we pass our method. Okay, so now we come down to get latest checkout, and so we'll return context.checkouts. The library asset.id is equal to the ID that we have passed this method. And so first of all, what this is going to do, here I'll correct my variable name here. And so far what this method is doing, what we're returning here is a collection. So far we're just returning the collection of checkouts for this particular library asset. And so what we need to do is we need to return the first or default checkout from this list, but we need to check out the one whose checkout date is the latest. And so what I can do here is I can call order by descending, and we have this since date on our checkout object. And so if I have 12 here, you can see that we have a since date and an until date on our checkout model. And so the since date corresponds to the checkout date. And so since we want to get the latest checkout, I simply get all of the checkouts corresponding to this particular asset ID, order them in descending order by the since date, and then grab the first or default instance from that list. And so it's going to grab the first one off the top of that collection, or null. All right, and now let's look at some of these methods here. Okay, so now we are down towards the bottom of the class where we are going to be looking at some of the void methods that are basically executing some of our core functionality. And so this is really where some of our main business logic comes into play. This mark lost and mark found methods, these should be relatively straightforward. So let's go ahead and just fill these out. Let's look at mark lost first. And so all we really want to do here with mark lost is simply update a library asset's status to the status that corresponds to lost. And so if you recall, in our status models, we have a few different types of statuses. I'm going to go ahead and fire up SQL Server Management Studio here, and we'll revisit that table. Okay, so I'm going to connect to LocalDB MS SQL LocalDB, and I'm going to extend databases here, and then we will look inside of our library dev database, and I'm just going to right click and select new query, and I'm going to select star from status. Select star from statuses. And you can see that I have some static data here. So this table is used strictly to represent static data. And I have 4 different statuses that an asset can exist in. We have checked out, available, lost, or on hold. And if you ran the script that we implemented in the previous video, that contained an insert to populate this table. I'll provide a link in the description below if you missed that and still need to populate your database with some of the demo data. In any case, just take note of the name here. So we're going to be implementing this name lost here when we're marking a library item as lost. You could do the same, probably a little bit cleaner, by defining an enum. In our case, we're simply going to do a simple string comparison here. In any case, let's look at how to implement that. So we'll define a item variable, and we'll say that the item is equal to a library asset, and we'll grab a single instance of a library asset from our library assets table, where the ID is equal to the asset ID that we passed this function. And we could probably refactor some of this, especially as we start to repeat ourselves multiple times throughout some of these methods. Or we could inject an instance of our library asset service into this service so that we have like a library asset get by ID method here. In any case, that would be something that we could do shortly in the future once we have this layer completed, and I'm just going to work through this without doing too much optimization. We could probably do better than to write some of the same code more than once here. Next thing we want to do anyway is to mark this item for update. So we want Entity Framework to start tracking it so that we can actually change its status value, of course. And what we're going to do is we're going to set its status here. So we'll say item.status is equal to, now let's just go to the statuses table and we'll grab the first or default status where the status name is equal to lost. All right, I'm just going to clean this up. And we will now just simply save changes. All right, so now let's think about our markFound method. And so first of all, we know that we are going to want to repeat some of this same method here. We're going to want to grab the asset by ID, and we are going to want to start tracking it for an update operation. And we're actually also going to want to then just simply update its status to found, but we have a little bit more to do after this. And I'm sorry, we want to, of course, mark it for available, which should correspond here to our available status. But now what I want to do is, if the item has been found, I want to remove any existing checkouts that are on that item, because the item may have been checked out when it was reported lost. And so we can simply try to grab the current checkout for that item, and then if it's not null, we will remove it. I will create a checkout variable. The library asset ID is equal to the asset ID that we pass our function here. And then what I'm going to do is clean this up again just so we can read a little bit more easily. And then what I'll say here is if checkout is not equal to null, then we will remove that checkout. Or in other words, by calling remove here, we are tracking this item for delete, such that when we eventually call save changes in this method, then that item will be deleted from the database. So it's going to remove that instance of a checkout on our library asset from the checkouts table. And so after we remove any existing checkouts, the next thing I want to do is to actually close any existing checkout history. So we track our checkout history, actually controlling that logic in code here. That may be something, again, you could do using a SQL shadow table or like a database trigger maybe. I just prefer for this project to just keep everything related to auditing our checkouts in code. And so we'll go to the checkout histories table and we'll say the first or default checkout history corresponding to this library asset ID, and the checked in is equal to null. So in other words, this would be an open checkout. I'm going to, again, just edit this so it's on multiple lines so that we can read it here a little bit easier. And so what this is going to return is it's going to return an instance from our checkout histories collection corresponding to this library asset ID and having a checked in value of null. And we'll simply say if, I'll scroll down here. Then let's go ahead and prepare to update that history by setting the history.checkedIn value to say now. Come to the top of this method here, and what I'm going to do is define now as datetime.now. And then finally we can call save changes, so context.save changes. This method could definitely be refactored into a few different steps here, particularly for things like removing existing checkouts on this item. So let's go ahead and just do that really quickly. So let's say we have a method called remove existing checkouts, and we can just go ahead and pass that the asset ID. We'll do this, and then if I control period here, it's going to allow us to generate this method. So I'm going to go ahead and generate it, and I'm just going to cut this code out here, and we will place it inside of this removed existing checkouts method. And then we'll scroll back up a little bit here, and I'll write a similar method here for closing out any existing checkout history. And this, it looks like we'll also probably have to pass our datetime value. of now. And so I'm going to go ahead and control period here, and then copy this code out, and we'll go ahead and paste that here. All right, and remove this exception. And neither of these methods we will call save changes in. We'll just call it once here, once this mark found operation is complete. Okay, we could create another method here and refactor out this update our status, because I see that we could use that again also when we mark the item as lost. And so that would be a nice way to sort of refactor out that and make these methods a little bit more granular. Let's go ahead and do that. So if I scroll back up here, and we'll say update asset status, pass it an asset ID, and in this case we'll pass it the string available, and I'll control period here on update asset status, and we'll generate that, and then I'll just go ahead and pass all of this here to this function. Okay, and now we can actually use this little helper method here again also down in our mark lost function here. With the asset ID and lost. Now, if I were to actually continue and clean up this code even more, I would probably move this mark lost and remove existing checkouts, anything that we're doing directly on a particular asset. So I'd move those into our library asset service because it's logic that pertains to our library asset object. I won't worry about cleaning up that too much right now. We'll just leave those helper methods here just to kind of get this example working. So now let's look at our checkin item. So we'll start this method out by defining a datetime.now because we will need to use that in a little bit here. And for the item, we need to again get the library asset corresponds to the asset ID we pass this function. And we need to mark that item for update. And now we need to once again remove any existing checkouts that are on that item because we're checking it in. And so I'm just going to go ahead and first just comment the steps that we're going to take when we check this item in, just so we stay on track with this the logic of this particular method. So the first thing I want to do is remove any existing checkouts on the item. Then I want to close any existing checkout history. And then I want to think about the hold process that we have. So we will be implementing logic for placing holds on an item. And we want it to be such that if any particular patron has a hold on an item, when that item is checked in by a patron that has the item checked out, that the asset will automatically get checked out to the patron who has the earliest hold placed. And so to break that down a little bit further, we're first going to look for existing holds on the item. Then if there are holds, check out the item to the library card with the earliest hold. And then otherwise, we will just update the item status to available so that other people can check it out. Okay, so that's kind of a few steps that we have to perform here, but we do have some helper methods now. So the first thing that we need to do is to go ahead and remove any existing checkouts. And we'll pass it the asset ID here. And now if I go back actually to that method, if you hit F12, notice that I am not calling save changes, but I am marking the checkout for remove here. Okay, so that's straightforward enough. Now we need to close any existing checkout history on the item. And we have a method for that as well. And this we need to pass the asset ID and then a date time. So we'll pass now. Okay, and now we need to look for any existing holds on the item. And we could write a helper method for that, but for now let's just think about what that looks like. Let's call it current holds. We'll say that we need to look in the holds table here. And I'm going to go ahead and include library assets. And I'm going to also include library cards. And we'll say where the library asset.id is equal to the ID of the asset. And so that's going to return a collection of holds potentially, or just an empty collection. So now we need to say if there are holds, in other words, if that's not an empty collection, check out the item to the library card with the earliest hold. So first of all, we definitely need to say if there are any current holds. So we can say if current holds.any. So .any is just going to return a Boolean value whether or not current holds has any elements. And then we need to check the item out to the earliest hold. So let's just go ahead and make a method for that. So we'll call it checkout to earliest hold, and we know we'll need to pass that the ID and the current holds in order to get the earliest one from that collection. We'll write that method in just a minute here, but otherwise we need to update the item status to available. And what we can do is we can say update asset status, pass it the asset ID, and we'll say available. And if you recall, this update asset status method actually contains this context .update to track this item for updates. So I'm going to hit back. And so what I can do is remove the update that we called here towards the top of this method. Okay. And then we can call context.saveChanges. All right, great. So now let's go ahead and very quickly write our checkout to earliest hold method. So I'll control period here and allow Visual Studio to generate this method for us. I'll remove the exception. And so let's store our earliest hold as a variable, and we'll say that that's equal to the current holds. So we pass this function a list of the current holds on the asset, and we can use the order by this time, which will sort this collection in ascending order. And we'll just go ahead and look for the hold place date by which we'll order this collection, and then simply grab the first one from the top of that set. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. So we get our current holds, we order them by the date that the hold was placed, and then we grab the first instance of those. So that should of course correspond to the earliest hold. Then we need to get the library card in order to check the item out to a library card. That should just be the earliest hold. .library card navigation property. So if I F12 here on library card, you can see that this corresponds to a virtual library card object. If we F12 there to go to that model, this is the object by which we check library assets out to. So if I click back twice, and so first what we should do is not to forget to actually remove that hold. So we'll remove earliest hold, or at least mark it for removal until we save changes, which we'll do now. So we need to do this because of course once the hold has been fulfilled to a checkout, then we no longer need a hold on it. And that way the logic for checking the item out to the next patron who has the item on hold will work properly. And then we simply need to check the item out. And so we can call checkout item. And we'll pass it the asset ID and the card ID. And so that actually takes us to writing the checkout item method. So if we F12 there, we can now write this method. Let's go ahead and delete the exception that we have here. The first thing I'd like to do here is just to check whether or not the item is checked out. And so we'll say if is checked out, asset ID, return, and we won't do anything here, but this is where you would want to add some logic to handle feedback to the user. If you want some kind of special feedback here that would say, hey, you just try to check an item out, which is already checked out, we're going to handle that in our user interface by not displaying that option to the user. But were they to find a way to call this method from our code here, and the item was already checked out, then it would probably cause some sort of inconsistency in our data and potentially damage our logic. There are other ways that we could handle this more elegantly, but the very simplest thing that you could do probably would be other than of course to handle it at the level of the UI, is to also handle it in code here with some sort of just check as to whether or not this item is already checked out. Let's go ahead and write this method really quickly. I'll control period and come down to the method, and we'll just store this as a bool. So we'll say is checked out, and we'll look in our checkouts where the checkout library asset .asset ID is equal to this asset ID. Library asset.id is equal to this asset ID .any, and I'll go ahead and clean this up. And so this is going to return false if this item isn't checked out. So it's actually going to go to the checkouts table. If it finds a corresponding library asset ID in the checkouts table corresponding to this ID that we're attempting to check out, then this would return true because it would return a single element there. So we can actually just return this value, and we could clean this up by just simply returning Okay, so we'll continue to work on our checkout item method now. And so let's go ahead and grab the asset object. And I'm just going to copy and paste that here from another method. Again, by now, this probably would have been a good point to go ahead and refactor this so that we are implementing our library asset service in this service so that we could get this ID a little bit more quickly without repeating ourselves so much. But in any case, we'll continue to use this for now until we refactor. But what we need to do again is to mark it for update, and we need to update its status. So in that case, actually, we can just simply call our update asset status again, pass it the asset ID, and it's going to be checked out. And so just to double check that, if we head back to our static data in our table here, checked out is the particular status corresponding to a library asset that has been checked out in our system. Again, another good place to implement an enum if you would like to clean this code up a little bit. Okay, and now let's find the library card that we want to check this item out to. And for that, we will look in the library cards table, and I'm going to go ahead and include checkouts here. And I'm going to grab the first or default library card, where the card ID is equal to the library card ID that we pass this checkout item function. Let's go ahead and clean this up so it's more readable. So we look in our library cards table, we include the checkouts navigation property here. Then I just grab the first library card ID, which should be the only library card ID because that's the library card's primary key, corresponding to the library card ID we pass checkout item. And then with this, since we have the item and the library card now, what we can do is create a new checkout. And so I'm going to go ahead and store that as a variable. Say var checkout is a new checkout. And the library asset on this checkout is of course equal to this library asset. The library card is equal to this library card. The since date on our checkout, in other words, when it was checked out, should be now. And until should be some certain time after now. So we'll need to write a rule for that, but let's store that as a method. So we'll say get default checkout time, and we'll pass that the variable now, which we actually need to define. So I'm going to go ahead and define that here. This is one of the reasons why I like to declare now inside of the method here, so that this since date actually gets, this now gets the same that our function get default checkout time would get here, whereas I think if we defined toDateTime.nows here, they would be very, very close to each other, but they wouldn't be the same value. And so I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that they are the same value. All right, and we'll go ahead and control period on get default checkout time. And so this is going to be just an ultra thin little method that we could update to change how long a particular item gets to be checked out. So we could do like a check in here to see if it's a book or a video, what type of library asset it is, and change the logic depending on that factor. For our case, it's just going to be really simple though. We're just going to return now.addDays, and we'll just say 30. But having this in a separate method here allows you to make this a little bit more flexible. All right, and so now that we have our new checkout, we can of course add it to our checkout table. And so we'll say add our checkout, and of course Entity Framework will handle inserting that record where it needs to go. It'll see that it's a checkout object that we have mapped to the checkout table, and it will insert a new record there. And then we can't forget that we need to add a new checkout history, because we're again handling that in code. This might be something that you handle, as I mentioned, in a shadow table in SQL Server or in a database trigger. But in our case, we're just keeping it all in code here. So we'll say checked out is equal to now. The library asset is equal to the item that we have here, of course. And the library card is equal to the library card. So we've got basically the same data here that we have again in our checkout object. It's just that our checkout history is a table that just grows infinitely over time as we have more and more checkouts, and our checkout table just dynamically adds or removes records depending on whether a library asset is currently checked out. All right, so now we'll go ahead and call context .add, and we'll also add the checkout history. And then we'll call context.save changes. We could definitely refactor adding the checkout history and adding the checkout into separate methods, but for now let's just carry on. But if we review our checkout item method for what it's doing, it is we should be able to follow the logic pretty easily. So we check if the item is checked out, and if it is already checked out, we just return. And we've saved this to add some additional logic later if we'd like. Then of course we grab the library asset ID and update its status to checked out. Then we grab the library card, and with that and the current date time, we can create a new checkout for that item. We can add it to the database, and then we can create a new checkout history and add that to the database, and then we can save changes. So again, this method is kind of long, and we should refactor it into 3 or 4 different methods, but for our case we're just going to leave it as it is for now for the sake of getting through our service layer. So I'm going to minimize that. We created helper method for the default checkout time and checking whether an item is checked out or not. So now let's look at this place hold method. So we'll remove the exception here, and we are going to need the time, so I'll create a variable for that again. And we're going to need the asset and the library card corresponding with these IDs. So we have our library asset and we have our card. And when we place a hold on the item, we need to first check whether or not it is available. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say if the asset.status.name is available, then we will update the asset status to on hold. And we can double check that syntax by looking again back at our data and confirming that the name for when an asset is on hold is just the string on hold here. So we've implemented that here. This step of checking whether or not the item is actually available or not is just so that we don't re-update an asset which already has the on hold status, to prevent us from doing something unnecessary here. But in any case, let's go ahead and create a new hold, and pretty straightforward. Basically, we have the hold place property, which is equal to now, the library asset, which is equal to the asset that we retrieved, and the library card, which is equal to the card. And now we can simply call context.addHold, and that will add the hold to the database, and any framework will take care of inserting that into the holds table. And then we will save changes to commit it to our data. Okay, so that's our place hold method. Let's go ahead and get through these 2 remaining methods for our checkout service. So the next one is to get the current hold patron name. Okay, and this ID, I should say, corresponds to a hold ID. So just for a little bit of clarity, I'm going to go ahead and say hold ID here. So let's go ahead and retrieve our hold. We're going to include the library asset navigation property, and we're also going to include in our query results the library cards, where the hold ID is equal to the hold ID that we pass our function here. And actually this where should be a first or default, because we're just trying to get the hold corresponding to this hold ID. And then we can get the card ID from that hold. And then from the card ID, we should be able to get the patron. So we'll look in our patrons table, and we'll be sure to include the library cards. And I'm going to call first or default here, where the patron's library card.id is equal to the card ID that we just looked up. And then now I can return the patron's first name, however you'd like to do this. This is a little bit, maybe a little bit hacky. You might actually just store like patron.fullname on the model and just use it as like sort of a computed value where you're just doing this logic in your model. In our case, I'm just going to do it here. But yeah, you might want to store the full name just as a property on Patron to make it a little bit more accessible. And I can see one thing that is actually going to be dangerous about this method is that hold here could be first or default if we look for a hold ID which doesn't exist. And so if hold is null here, and then we try to call .libraryCard on a null object here, it's going to throw an exception. And so I could put a question mark here, which is a null conditional operator. That will prevent a null reference exception here when we try to call this library card navigation property on a null object. And so if card ID is null here, then patron will return null. And so let's go ahead and put a null conditional on both times that we use the patron variable as well. All right, I'm just going to clean this up just a little bit here. Okay, almost done with this. Well, almost done the first pass here before we do any sort of cleanup, of which there's plenty to do in this particular class for sure. But let's go ahead and fill out this get current hold placed date time. For that, I'm going to need the hold. Again, violating the don't repeat yourself quite a bit here, but in any case. And here we will simply grab the hold placed off of our first default here. And that's actually just what we need to return. Again, another great place to refactor this method if we created a hold service, or if we handle all the hold logic as well in our checkout service to nonetheless write helper methods for grabbing holds by IDs, just the same that we would grab any other entity by its ID. So we've repeated a lot of code here to do that, for instance, for assets and library cards, for instance. Okay, that reminds me, I think there are two more methods actually on our interface here that I would like to implement. And the first is I would like to see the current patron who has an item checked out. So I'm going to go ahead and define the name of that method here. And yeah, let's just implement that method as well. I think that'll be useful on our detail page. I'm just going to go ahead and organize this a little bit, put the add towards the top here. I'll put our void methods together here. Put the methods that return collections together. And I'll get the methods that return simple data together as well. Okay, so that looks a little bit cleaner. Very good. Let's go ahead and I'm going to control period here and clean up those usings. Head back into our service, and it's going to be upset with us that we haven't implemented the new method that we just created. So we'll control period here and implement this final method. Scroll down to the bottom of our class here. And let's think about how we'll get the current checkout patron. So let's first of all get checkout by asset ID. So I'm just going to create a method for that here. And we'll implement that like this. We'll say the checkout is equal to context.checkouts, and we'll go ahead and include library assets and library cards, where the library asset.id is equal to this asset ID that we passed this function, and we'll call first or default. So in fact, we can replace our where with first or default here. Alright, and then let's just return that. So we'll go ahead and this needs to be a checkout, of course. And so what we'll say is if that returns null, we're just going to say not checked out. Otherwise, we'll go forth and go ahead and get the card ID. Actually, we can write it like this. Checkout is equal to get checkout by asset ID, and then we'll check that for null. And we'll say that the card ID is equal to checkout.librarycard.id, and then the patron is equal to the context.patrons. We'll include their library cards and library assets. p.librarycard, where the patron's library card.id is equal to this card ID. And again, that's just a first or default. And what we'll do is then again return the patron's first name. I kind of feel like once we go back and refactor this, that things like this, since this method, its job should be to return the current checkout patron's name as a string. And the default value for a string is an empty string. I kind of feel like we should just return an empty string here and then handle the logic for what we want to display on the page in the controller. So I'm going to do that instead. Again, I'm just kind of going through a first pass through all of this logic and there are going to be a lot of places that we could refactor and ensure that our concerns are separated properly. The first thing that you probably should want to do at this point is to write all the other services that will handle getting various properties by their primary key, which we have done way too many times in this particular service. But in any case, this should actually finally complete the service class for our checkout. So if you've made it this far and slogged through, then congrats, because you should now be able to implement it in your controller and see the results of all the logic you've written here in the application. All right, so now let's go ahead and head back up into our catalog controller, and we're going to now work on the detail action result here. So this will basically be working on the detail page for any of the library assets that we click on from our index view that we worked on in the previous video. So you'll notice that we are making use of the iLibrary asset interface here. We also now have access to our iCheckout interface, and we can go ahead and make sure that gets injected into our constructor here, and we will assign this private field. And remember, just in case you missed it towards the beginning of this video, that we in our startup class here made sure and we basically registered that service inside of our configure services method in the start.cs file, adding a scoped instance of our checkout service here in configure services so that it can get injected here inside of our controller. And so let's go ahead and fill out our detail view. So remember, this detail view will display a summary of all the information that we want to show on our particular library asset. So we're going to be returning a new model, of course, to this to our detail page. And so let's go ahead and define it. So we'll say a model is a new asset detail model. So in order to fill out this asset detail model, we should actually retrieve the asset corresponding to the ID that we passed this detail action result. So let's go ahead and do that. We can very simply use our library asset service. And so now as we build out our asset detail model, a lot of the properties on it are just going to map one-to-one off of this asset object. Otherwise, we'll implement methods that are in our library asset service or checkout service to populate. So the asset ID is just equal to the ID, of course. We have a get type method on our library asset service. All of these values here are simply available on the asset object. We have a method for getting the author or director. Likewise, we have a method for getting the current location. And remember that current location in our view model here is a string, and so that should just map to the current location object's name property. And now for the checkout history. This will be on the checkout service that we just completed writing. The ISBN number is on our asset service. The latest checkout is on our checkout service. The patron name is on checkouts, checkout patron. And current holds. So current holds, let's store that as just a simple variable here, because we have two methods in our checkout service which get the date that the hold was placed and the patron. So if we come up here, let's just store that here, current holds by ID. And from this, let's use the link select and select this into a new asset hold model, of course. And so this asset hold model is the current holds. So that's why I say of course here. If you recall, this is a collection of asset hold models, and so we can use link select to select any type of object into a collection of asset hold models. And so we'll say hold place is equal to checkouts.get current hold placed by the asset ID, and the patron name is checkouts.get current hold patron name. Okay, so get current hold placed is actually returning a date time. So if we come back here, what I can do is I can just call .toString here, and I'm going to do lowercase d for the short date format on this datetime object. Okay, with this detail controller action complete, let's tie it all together by going into our detail view here. So under the views folder, then under catalog, we will revisit this detail.cshtml. And if you recall, we have a basic detail page here, which is going to display some of the data that is on our asset detail model object. And so we've got some of the metadata on the particular library asset. We've got some control here to show what type of button. We show the user whether or not they can check the item out, mark it as found, or place a hold, etc. And then we have some more metadata here. It looks like we don't have a DUI call number, but we do have a DUI. Okay, so that was a typo there. And finally, what I'd like to do here is to create a table for the current holds and the checkout history. So let's just add that very quickly here. And for the sake of time here, I'm going to just go ahead and paste that and review the HTML. Again, all of this code will be available on GitHub once this project is complete, or you can feel free to copy it here as we go through it, but I'm just going to review it very quickly. So we've got a new bootstrap row, and I'm going to create a table of checkout histories. And so we've got heading there. And then similar to the way that we looked at Razor syntax in the previous video for dynamically creating a list of objects from a collection, we're going to use the spiral for each syntax here, and then look at for each checkout in our model's checkout history collection. We'll go ahead and grab the checked out, checked in, and library card ID for each of those checkout objects. And then if we scroll down, I've got a second column in this row for current holds that are on the library asset. And so we have another table here looking at the collection of current holds on this detail model. If you want to add more sort of control flow here, then you can do like an at if holds.any and then display like a message if there are no holds on the library asset. Otherwise, this table will just be an empty table, which might be fine as well. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and fire up the application, and we'll debug any types of issues that arise when we hit the page. Okay, so we still have the template landing page. We haven't done anything to change that, but if we visit /catalog, this will take us back to our library asset index page. And then if we click on a book here, okay, it looks like everything is more or less working in terms of displaying properly. You can see that we have all of the items metadata, and we're not getting any sort of runtime errors here as we visit the page. It does look like we have an extra column in our checkout history table here. So if I minimize this and then look for that, come down, yes. So I've got an extra th tag here, so I'll save that and go back to the page. If I refresh, okay, so that's cleaned up. Note that you don't need to stop the server if you're just working within the view, but for any of the other sort of compiled code, you will need to stop the server. So if we were working in our service layer or controllers fixing bugs, then we need to actually close this browser and stop the server while we were working. All right, so that's good. Now let's very quickly, since we have the business logic for it, go ahead and wire up this checkout button. So let's take a look at how to do that. So I'm going to close the browser and head back into our catalog controller, and we'll minimize this detail action. But what I'll do is I'll create a new action result called checkout, and we'll pass that the asset ID again. And what I'd like to do is to create a sort of confirm page for this checkout action, from which we will actually call the logical checkout, if you will, because what we need to do is we'll click checkout as any user, and then on that checkout page, we will be able to insert the library card ID to check that item out. So at this point, hopefully you are kind of getting the feel for how this MVC pattern is working. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a checkout model here, checkout page model. And I'll do that by creating a new folder here. So we're going to go ahead and add a new folder called checkout. And to this, I will add a new class called checkout models. And this one's going to be very simple, so I'll just paste it here. This page, we will just need to pass a library card ID. We'll have the book title and its asset ID, of course. The cover of the book, the number of patrons who have this item currently on hold, and a bool to store whether or not the item is already checked out. If we go back into our catalog controller, you can see that we also need to bring in our models. Oops, and I actually just named this incorrectly. So if I right click over here, and we'll rename this to checkout model, and say yes to update project references. So now if I click back again, and then control period on our checkout model and import the model namespace. And so you can see I simply get the library asset by ID that we pass our checkout method here, and we construct this new checkout model where we simply fill in the these properties, which are very straightforward, just the asset ID, the image, title, the library card ID, which we will set up as an empty string, and then this bool is checked out. And it looks like for some reason I did not implement is checked out on our interface. Let's go ahead and add that here. I believe that we actually did implement a method called is checked out in our service. So if we go ahead and take a look there, it's saying that we haven't. So I'm going to control period on I check out and implement it. And if we head down to the bottom of the class here, okay, it is, I think it's a little bit confused here because it's trying to namespace this is checked out. So what I'm going to do is head back up to where we have defined is checked out. And I'm going to F12 here, and I'm going to go ahead and just make this public. And then the interface should be satisfied. Okay, so you want to make sure that you have a public method is checked out that returns a bool. And so we'll head back into our controller here. And yeah, so this checkout page here is very simple. It just contains some of that data here. And now what I want to do is, well, we'll build the checkout page here very quickly, or I'll show you the HTML for it. But let's think about what we want to do when we're on that page. Well, we actually want to perform the action of placing a checkout. So let's go ahead and we'll make another action result, call it place checkout. And we know that we're going to need to pass the asset ID and the library card ID to this function. And we know that we wrote methods in our checkout service to actually do this and update our database. So let's just implement them here. So we'll say checkouts checkout item, and we pass it the asset ID and library card ID. And now we're going to return a redirect to action, and we'll return back to the detail page. And the way that we specify which detail page is we create a new object here, so new object, and we just set the ID of this object equal to our asset ID. Okay, so that's simple enough. So now when we actually perform this place checkout option, we go to our database and perform all the necessary steps to create a new checkout, as we covered earlier in this video, and then we're simply going to redirect to the detail action slash the asset ID that we just came from. And since we are going to be submitting this from a form, then I would like to add the HTTP post attribute to this place checkout method. And so this attribute just means that this action only supports the HTTP post method as opposed to, say, like a get request. Likewise, while we're in here, let's go ahead and just finish out these other two methods that we have in our system. So we have the ability to place a checkout, but we also have the ability to place a hold. And in our checkout service, we also have a method for that called place hold. And we have a couple of other really simple actions here, and we do those from just a simple button on the detail page. So in that case, we can say like mark lost by ID. And again, this is in our checkout service. And just for consistency here, I'm going to call this asset ID. And then of course we have a mark found. And then similar to the way that we place a checkout by visiting a checkout page and then performing the place checkout action, let's build our action result for visiting the place hold page before we place the hold action. And this is in fact going to look essentially identical to our checkout model. We want to display all the same information on this page, so I'm going to reuse our checkout model to place holds as well. There's really not much distinction between what makes something a checkout and a hold, except that a hold in a sense is almost like a checkout queue in the design of our particular system. Except when we visit this page, I would also like to implement a hold count, which we can get from the count returned on get current hold when we pass it the asset ID. And let's go ahead and make sure that I have the correct punctuation here. All right, and then very quickly now let's go ahead back to our views and create those checkout and hold views. So I'll come here under our catalog and I'm going to create a new item, MVC view page, checkout, and we'll do the same thing to add a new MVC view page, hold. And again, for the sake of time here, I'm going to paste some HTML. Okay. And again, all this code will be available to you when the series is complete. Otherwise, feel free to take a look here at what I have. And we need to make sure that we're bringing in the correct namespaces here. Checkout model. And here's an instance of using that razor view bag syntax that I spoke about. So I'm actually just going to remove it, but do know that it's an option to you if you'd like to specify objects on this view bag object that you can use to display anything on your page. I'm defining a section scripts here, which again is not necessary, but something you can do if inside of your template under shared, in our case inside of our layout.cshtml, I have this render section scripts, which isn't necessarily required. And then here I have this at section styles. So inside of our template, what I'm going to do is go ahead and render another section here, styles, and make sure that that's not necessarily required either. So if you only need certain JavaScript libraries on particular pages and you don't want them loaded universally across your entire application, rendering them inside of sections here is one sort of more modular way to do that. I've got a bootstrap container, I've got a simple heading here, and then I've got some comments in here letting you know you could use tag helpers as well, but we're going to be again using this HTML helper, so this is more razor syntax. This is how we create a form, and we are going to specify that we are actually posting this form back to the server. So this form will take a text box for our library card ID and a button which will submit the form, and it's going to post back this library card ID to our place checkout method that we have in our controller. And since we have applied the HTTP post attribute to that place checkout action result, this method will work for us. Notice the only other important thing we have here is this @HTML hidden for asset ID, which is also going to be required by our place checkout method. So if we come back into the controller, just to review that very quickly, remember our place checkout method here takes an asset ID and a library card ID, and it has this HTTP post attribute. And so it's going to use our checkout service and take those two parameters that are passed from our view and implement them in this checkin item method that we are using in that service. Once that's complete, we are just going to redirect back to the detail page for this asset ID, again coming from the page. And so this is our HTML hidden for, and this library card ID is passed from the text box on this form here. Okay, our holds page will look very similar. Oops, this is our holds page, so what I'm going to do is just make sure that this goes over to our checkout page. And in fact, our holds is going to look almost identical. So we'll just paste everything back into our holds as well. And let's go ahead and paste that here. And we'll just change a few things. So we'll say place hold on library item. And then we'll scroll down a little bit here. And then right before our form, I will create a paragraph tag. And this will be one part that I will write by hand. It's pretty simple. There are currently at model.holdCount holds in the queue for this item, and we'll close out that tag. And then if we come back up here, notice if you recall, we are using the same model for checkouts and holds, so the model directive here should be the same, and we have hold count on that. And then of course, instead of the place checkout method, we want to hit the place hold method, which is still on our catalog controller and is still defined as an HTTP post method. And we pass it all the same information, except that instead of placing a checkout, we place a hold. So we'll make the button say place hold. And instead of a button success bootstrap class, we'll say button info. And yeah, so that's looking pretty good, I think. So let's go ahead and fire it up and see if things are working or if we need to do some more debugging. Okay, one issue that I did run into, and I apologize, I didn't realize that I was not recording for that, but we got an error, we got a namespace error that said checkout was used as a type but is a namespace, and that's because I had inside of our view models folder here, so under the library web project models, this checkout models folder was simply named checkout. And so folders by default in this project were namespace providers. And so you could either reconfigure these folders so they're not namespace providers, or just simply change the name of this folder to checkout models. And then I updated all references of checkout models namespace to checkout models instead of models.checkout. So if you run into that, I apologize, but you should just be able to apply that quick fix. And now I will restart the browser to see if we have any other actual issues with our code. Okay, so let's go ahead and visit a detail page for one of our library assets. And let's see what happens when we click checkout. Okay, so we get taken to this page, which it looks like we need to format a little bit better. We'll work on the front end maybe a little bit later. Let's go ahead and see if our form works here by inserting a library card ID. So I'll insert the number 1 here, and then I will click checkout. Okay, and it looks like it redirected, but I'm not sure that it actually registered at checkout because I see that we still have this checkout button. And so this would be a good chance for us to do some debugging with some breakpoints. And so what I'll do is I'll fire up first SQL Server Management Studio, and we'll check our checkouts table to see if it has any records. And it does not. So we know that our checkout action did not actually post correctly. So what we'll do is we'll head back into the code and make sure that the server is still running, and we'll head over into our catalog controller here. And what I'm going to do is place a breakpoint here, first of all on our checkout action result, and then I'll reload this page. So if you place a breakpoint by clicking in the gutter here, we'll go back to the page. So now I'm just going to go ahead and click checkout again. And so we hit our breakpoint. We can see that we are passing the ID. So if you hold your mouse over each of the variables that you'd like to inspect, you can see. Now I'm going to hit F10 to step into this method. And we are going to be using the asset service, which is not null, which is good. And so now we have an instance of our asset here. We can see all of the properties on it, so it's looking pretty good. And we construct a new model, and the model's properties are all, they look evaluated correctly. We have the asset ID, no holds, an image, we have false for is checked out, we have an empty string for the library card ID, and the title of Emma is correct. And so now we're going to return this view. So I'm going to hit F5 now to just continue executing all of the code. And now we're on the checkout page. And so what I'd like to do now is to put the number 1 back in our field here. And then back in the code, let's go to our place checkout action result. And I'm going to place a breakpoint here. And in fact, I already see the error. So I'm calling checkin item here inside of our place checkout method. So let's just go ahead and run the method anyway and be sure that we're at least passing our asset ID and library card ID. So we'll come back to the form, and if we click checkout, you can at least see now that we are hitting the HTTP post method. We're passing the asset ID and the library card ID. It's just that I'm actually performing a check-in instead of a checkout. So that was just a typo so far. So we'll go ahead and stop server, and I'll put the appropriate method name here. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and keep this breakpoint on, and we'll restart the server and see if we can get it to work this time. And we'll just go ahead and revisit the same page again, and we'll go ahead and click checkout. We'll hit our breakpoint, and I'm just going to click continue, or you can hit F5. And now I'll put 1 back in our text field here again and click checkout this time. And this time I'm just going to hit F5 and see if we run into any errors in the checkout process. Okay, so I can see that we still have a bug because we're still showing the checkout button here, but I can see that the checkout history is now getting populated. So let's confirm in SQL Server Management Studio that a checkout exists. And so we can see that it does and that it was just placed. So let's take a look at the asset status, which we know is the property that controls the logic as to what buttons get displayed here. I'm going to select from library assets where asset ID is equal to 1, or where ID is equal to 1. And we have a status ID of 2. So what we can do here is, let's go ahead and do this. We'll do it this way just to get some SQL in here. Select title ID from library assets. We'll say, we'll alias this is LA. So we'll say LA.title, LA.ID from library assets LA. And we'll go ahead and interjoin statuses S on S.ID is equal to LA.status ID, where LA.ID is equal to 1. Let's just select everything from the statuses table, that'll be fine. So S.star, we'll F5. And we can see that the status is still available. So we need to find out why we're not actually correctly updating our status when we're checking the item out. So let's go very briefly take a look at our code and see what's happening there. So let's F12 on checkout item. And actually, sorry, that just takes us to the interface, of course. So let's actually go down into our checkout service. And I'll Control F to find checkout item. And so I can see that we are calling update asset status. So if I F12 on this, update asset status is actually just always marking the asset status as available. So that's our bug here. Of course, what I need to do is update it to whatever status I pass this method. And so it's kind of a silly bug, but we will make sure this says new status. And instead of just hard coding available for no matter what we do, we will make sure that we assign the new status here. Okay. Let's go ahead and fire our application back up. It'll be a really good example of why unit tests are important, why even test-driven development will help you avoid these kind of debugging issues. But this is a small enough application, I think in our cases, there's not really an excuse, but yeah, at least it's good to get some debugging in and fixing some issues. And what I'd like to do really quickly before we go through and place another checkout is to just delete from checkouts, and we'll delete from checkout histories. We only have 2 entries in those, or 1 entry in each. That way we don't try to check out an item that we already have a checkout record for, of course. And so now we'll take a look back at our page. And if we click checkout, I'm going to remove this breakpoint because that just was checking that we go to the checkout page correctly. And then again, I'll place a 1 here, and we'll place a checkout. And let's see if we have any other issues to debug. Okay, so it looks like this worked correctly this time. We can see that the item is checked out by this patron. You know, you may or may not want to display the patron name here. That's how I chose to do it for this page. You may just want to display the library card ID. But now we have the option to check in the item or place a hold. So let's go ahead and for one thing, we'll check our checkouts again here. And we'll rewrite some SQL here just for fun. Select C.star from checkouts C, interjoin by, let's say, like library cards LC on LC.ID is equal to C dot library card ID. If we have 5 there. And let's also add, of course, LC.star. And if we wanted to see the patron name, then I could also interjoin patrons P on P dot library card ID is equal to LC dot ID. And let's just do P dot last name, p dot first name, and let's run this little script. And yeah, so we can see Jane Patterson has the library asset checked out. Yeah, so we can see that the checkout process seems to have worked. Okay, so once we wire up the check-in method, this record should disappear. Let's first check the place hold. So I'll click this. We can see that there are currently 0 holds in the queue for this item. So let's allow customer 2 to place a hold, and we'll see if this works. Okay, so here we get a null reference exception. So we have a null reference exception on the asset status, which is null. So when we retrieve assets, we need to make sure we include the status navigation property. So we'll go ahead and fix that bug here. So this is in our place hold method. And I think if I just be sure to include, that should resolve this issue. Let's go ahead and confirm that. And we'll go back to that detail page and we'll try to place our hold again. And we'll use customer 2 and we'll see if we run into any other snags here. Okay, so it seemed to work. Margaret Smith now has a hold, and we can double check that in our database again here. I'm just gonna go ahead and comment this stuff out for a minute. And so now let's select star from holds. And I won't worry about doing any inner joins. I think you'll get the idea here, that we have a library cart ID of 2, and the hold was just placed. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's make sure we can place a second hold. And we'll place the hold. And now we can see that another patron, and we'll just place one more here. We can see that a third patron here. Okay, so the current holds is looking correct. Our checkout history is so far correct. Let's go ahead and write our check-in method really quickly. This will be a very short one. I don't think that we've written it yet, so I'm going to head back here, stop the server, go into our catalog controller, and we'll get rid of this breakpoint. Scroll up, and yeah, we just need to write our check-in. And so put that right under checkout. Because of course all we're going to do is go to our checkout service and call check-in item on that ID. And we will redirect back to the detail view. All right, so check-in item. So let's F12 here. And it is saying it requires an asset ID and a library card ID, which I know that we don't need the library card here. So I'm going to save this on our interface and go back into our service again here, which we can find here is it'll give us an error now that the service we're using doesn't implement the interface correctly. So I'll head down to check-in item, and I can see that we have this library card ID here, which of course we don't use when we check this item in. And so I'll go ahead and clean this method up here. We'll save it, saying asset ID does not exist in the current context. Okay, so let's make sure this, we'll make sure this parameter is named properly. And I should be consistent really across all of these. As I would go back through and refactor this, I would like to be clear about what IDs we're passing around, so I'd probably change this everywhere it's needed from ID to asset ID or hold ID or whatever it is that the particular ID the method is using. Okay, so check-in looks good. I want to double check on the view whether or not we're using check-in with a lowercase I here or not. To our detail page, and if we come down to if it's checked out, check-in, yes, I had it with an uppercase I, so I'll go back, and yeah, I like that formatting better. So let's fire it up and finally check out whether or not the last little bit of functionality is working. Okay, so back to a detail page. The item is checked out. When we check it in, it's checked out by Jane Patterson. When we check it in, it should then automatically get checked out to this Margaret Smith patron. So let's go ahead and try it because she's the one with the oldest hold on it. And in fact, we should display like a date time value here with some times as well to confirm the earliest hold. Okay, so we have another null exception here. and that's because the item is null here. The asset ID we're actually passing this update asset status method is 0. So that's not correct. Okay. And so on our checkin method here, we can see that we have an asset ID of 0. Which should not be the case, obviously. So let's go back to the page that this is on and make sure that our form is submitting that ID value properly. So I'm going to hit the stop button here. And we'll go back to our detail page. And it's interesting that the route ID should correspond to the asset ID that's on the model. This is the same one that we used when we checked the item out. And so I think I know what the issue is here. I think that Entity Framework is actually expecting in our controller here for this to actually just correspond to the variable ID here instead of asset ID because of the way that we named this model perhaps. So I'm going to change it here and see if this is actually our issue. So I'm going to go ahead and start the server back up. And we'll revisit the page again. And now we'll try to check it in. I would like to set a breakpoint, so let's go ahead and do that. Check it in. And yeah, now the ID is getting passed. So I suppose you'll want to make sure that in each of these action results where we are not making an HTTP post, just calling an action result and passing some ID property from the model back to our controller here, that the params that we pass these methods are written as ID instead of asset ID. So I'm going to go ahead and continue, and yeah, we can expect that to work properly. We've got one issue here though, is that the current holds queue has decreased by 1, but I don't see that this book is checked out to a new patron. I do see a new checkout created here, but interestingly enough, I don't see that patron's name. Also notice that the button here says checkout, which should imply that this book is available. And so let's go ahead and go back to our database really quickly and see if we can kind of figure out what's happening here. So we'll select star from checkouts, and we can see that the book is checked out to library card ID 2. And so let's select star from library assets, where ID is equal to 1. And we can see that the status is back to 2 here. If we rerun this query, yeah, we can see that it's actually marked available. So we have a break in our logic here somewhere. So what I'm going to do is delete from checkouts, and we'll also delete from holds. And we'll also delete from checkout histories. Okay. And let's go take a look at what's happening when we follow the chain of logic of checking an item in. So go back into the code, and when we reach this checkin method and we go to the checkout service to check in the item, let's go ahead and revisit the checkout service and check in the item. So for the asset ID, which we know is now getting passed properly, we get the date, we get the asset corresponding to that ID, we remove any existing checkouts, we close any existing checkout histories, which that looked correct, and we certainly removed any existing checkouts, but the problem is we didn't actually update the status of the asset to checked out. And so let's scroll down, we look for existing holds on the item. If there are any holds, we check it out to the earliest hold. Looks like that worked correctly. Otherwise, update the item status to available. And so here we need to actually return. So I'm going to stop. And what I was doing here, of course, is I was checking it out to the earliest hold, and then I was updating the status to available. I should have had this in an if-else or an if this and then return. Let's see if this works now. I think this should solve our issue. Catalog detail /1, and I'm going to go ahead and check the item out. This time we'll check it out to someone new. We'll just say patron 4. And so Mary Lee has this item checked out. Let's place a hold. So patron 5 and patron 6. And now when Mary Lee checks the item in, let's go ahead and click check in. And we'll F5 past our breakpoint. And yes, now the patron who placed the hold first has it checked out, we have closed the first checkout history item and opened another one. And we'll go ahead and place checkin again. And I'm going to delete this breakpoint and hit F5. And now our patron who placed the second hold has the item checked out. And let's go ahead and have it checked in again. And now you can see that the book is once again available and can be checked out. So yeah, so far so good. That was a little bit of debugging that we did there due to some quickly constructed code, if you will. But this shows us that our basic business logic is now in place. We have a little bit of work to do on the UI. It looks like we've got some issues here. Certainly we can tackle that in the next video. We also have to go back and check out our mark lost and mark found buttons, which aren't showing up here, and for which we actually need to come back and make these params that we pass to those methods simply ID instead of asset ID, so we'll do that as well. But yeah, if you made it this far, great work. We have now completely finished one of our service classes. We could definitely do a ton of refactoring in this class. And yeah, so thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next part in this series. And as always, if you have any questions or run into any issues, feel free to send me a message and we'll work through them together. Thanks.